Right, so before we crack into the MAVlink update, which we'll do in just a second, just an announcement for the last session that's coming up this afternoon, which is the dev team panel discussion. So for anyone out there on YouTube or in the room, just put a message either into the YouTube chat, the Discord chat, or the whiteboard that's up here at the front, just to start collecting topics and questions for what people want to hear from the dev team about. So that we can spend the next session after this one coordinating out ready for the last session. Cool. All right, so I would like to thank Andrew for scheduling me for the first session after lunch on the last day for what is probably the driest topic we've got all weekend. Challenge accepted, I guess. What we're not going to do is try to make this over too exciting. It's MAVlink, it's important, but not exciting. And Hamish and I will just basically step through how we manage MAVlink at the moment, where we want to take it, and kind of the journey in between with just a bit of a 101 overview of MAVlink for those listening in that kind of perhaps wonder why there is so many rub points within MAVlink and why it can be a bit of a challenge to wrap your head around. Right. So leading on from that, basically this is just the quick overview. How MAVlink is managed much like RGPilot through development calls, pull requests into GitHub. The core management team for MAVlink Common, if you like, is basically Hamish and myself and Julian O's. Conveniently, we're all in very similar time zones, but basically every second Wednesday, I race home from work, we sit down, we do a dev call and work out what's ready to go into Common, what's still waiting for implementations or requires further testing, and gather the community feedback via issues or comments on those PRs to kind of figure out where the shortfalls are and what direction we need to take things. That's very much how MAVlink is managed at the message definition level, particularly within common.xml. What's worth pointing out here, though, is that MAVlink is really two very separate parts. One is those message definitions, be they common.xml, RGPilot mega.xml, or any of the other dialects, but it's also the tooling. And what I'm not going to spend time on today, mainly because I'm not the right guy to be talking about it, is the tooling behind MAVlink. And it's really the tooling that defines what MAVlink is as a communications protocol. So PyMAVlink, which contains the schema for the MAVlink messages, plus all the generators for the headers and how MAVlink is actually applied, all of that fits within PyMAVlink, and that's managed within the RGPilot project primarily by Tridge and Peter and a few others, such as Amilcar, who looks after the schema and tries to coordinate up and down. So if there are any questions that relate specifically to PyMAVlink, we'll perhaps save those questions to the end, and I'll throw Peter or Tridge under the bus. Right, MAVlink 101. This is just most people in this room probably know all of this, but we'll just step through it. So that's the general overview. For the developers, there's some links. The next slide is kind of what I wanted to talk to.
Can I just stop for a second? The reason I put this up is because I have a slightly different in my head story of how this is going to be, is that you'll notice there are links to the wiki about what's supported and what's not supported. Later on, I'm going to talk about some of the pain points of MAVlink, and that's one of them, not knowing what's supported all the time. So that's where you find out within RGPilot what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, exactly. So just because a message exists or is defined doesn't mean it's used, which is kind of that point there, and that could cause challenges or frustration. Right. MAVlink does two key things. And they're very, very different use cases and drive different design decisions and have different challenges. And you'll find that some of the inconsistencies in MAVlink are basically driven by the conflict, I guess, of what these two use cases are. So the one thing that MAVlink does, that only MAVlink does, is provide your telemetry stream to the ground station. That's a bidirectional link, but the nature of each direction is fundamentally different. In that the vehicle is basically just advising your ground station of state, just relatively low rate updates of what the vehicle is doing and what it knows about itself. In the other direction, coming up from the ground station, you're primarily giving commands or updating emission, that type of thing. What both those things have in common is that they're relatively low rate, and they are usually via a radio link, which is quite often an unreliable or lossy link. That drives some particular, I guess, conditions within MAVlink, and one such as resending or acknowledgements that enable MAVlink to function reasonably well over that kind of link and provide that function. Why I highlight that as the primary or that first use case of MAVlink is because only MAVlink provides that function to RGPilot. The secondary role is basically an internal bus, whether that's between the companion computer and the autopilot, or the autopilot and other peripherals such as gimbals or rangefinders, those kind of sensors. That's even though it's still MAVlink, that's a very different implementation and use case. So where we're looking at normally a hardwired link, in RGPilot's case at the moment, that's a UART. You generally have much higher reliability. You generally don't actually care that much if you drop messages, as long as it's not too many. So you end up with basically streaming messages and a much different kind of construct and much different kind of constraints. I'm calling that a secondary role because there are actually other ways to do that, be that through different UART protocols, be they proprietary ones for gimbals or any other peripheral, or ROS, either via the MAVROS bridge, which brings it into MAVlink, but is fundamentally a different structure, or hopefully moving forward, DDS with ROS2, which will be able to use even UART or Ethernet, but is coming into RGPilot at a lower layer than how MAVlink's currently handled, and has access to more state if we want to give it to them. Point being that there are other ways to do what MAVlink does on board. At the moment, though, because we're trying to do both, the protocol and any changes to it have to be able to handle both. And that really comes down to implementers understanding the differences between those two use cases and not trying to do things that really shouldn't be attempted with MAVlink. So if we want something, if we want to be pushing out, high rate data, then you probably don't want to be doing that over a radio link if you can avoid it. And you probably don't want to be pushing, your Vicon stuff. You need to, but generally you're in a lab, so it doesn't matter if things go wrong too much. But just acknowledging that there are those two use cases becomes important when trying to understand why messages are defined how they are and how the microservices within MAVlink are defined how they are.
That's all good.
Right. I'm going to throw to Hamish on this.
This is your slide.
In a second. But contributing to MAVlink, this is something that throughout RGPilot, PX4, the other implementers of MAVlink, we generally don't do very well, and it probably takes more time than I'd like trying to get people to, I guess, follow a process so that we can maintain the interoperability, standardization as far as we can within custom.xml, within common.xml, and not kind of break the hierarchy, I guess, of what goes where, when. So common.xml. Common.xml is, whilst RGPilot maintains a fork and maintains control of its own common.xml within the RGPilot fork, for standardization changes to common, in the first instance, we like those to go upstream into the MAVlink repo, so that the discussion about the broader utility of that message can happen with the other stakeholders. And it might be that if those changes aren't broadly accepted or aren't broadly able to be used by the other consumers of MAVlink, it might be better that we then provide the feedback to go, actually, let's create a new message in RGPilot Mega, so that we can maintain interoperability up at the common.xml level, while still allowing ArduPilot to do what it needs to do or affect the changes it needs to make. Conversely, ArduPilot Mega is that's our dialect. They're our message definitions. We have complete control of those. Whilst we will push those just for synchronization up into the MAVlink upstream repo, they're controlled by ArduPilot. We do what we want in there effectively. Doesn't mean there's less control, less discussion, less testing. It just means we don't have to worry about other stakeholders because they're messages that only affect us. I've put custom dialects in here as well, just basically to talk about how you can use them very briefly, but more for the second dot point there, which is don't use the reserved message space in the MAVlink 1 ID range. The key thing there is if you start using those messages as a vendor and you start trying to have, and you end up, working in a fleet of aircraft or vehicles where other vendors have also used that message range, you'll get message conflicts, you open yourself up to a range of issues that step back from the intent of that interoperability of MAVlink. If you have a closed ecosystem and you don't care about interoperating with anyone else, go for your life. But on the broad, don't use them. Don't use them. There's nothing to be gained by doing it. What you should be doing, if you do want to be implementing custom messages for your own use cases, is through the MAVlink organization, put a PR into all.xml, reserve a range of IDs in the MAVlink 2 range. There's thousands of them. We're not likely to run out anytime in the next decade. And that way you can just get a range of message IDs that you can use. You don't need to tell anyone what those messages are. You just need to tell them not to use those message IDs. And that will preserve that interoperability and avoid message conflicts. At the moment, because of the way the parsing happens, no one else will be able to read those messages anyway. They'll fail, they won't have the CRC, they'll get started. But you won't have a conflict. So, at least the message will only do what it's meant to do and not have any kind of undefined behaviors. More than that though, before creating custom messages, before creating custom dialects, please look through what already exists in MAVlink. With all the dialects, there's a lot of use cases that are already being explored, already being defined. So there's a pretty good chance that what you think is a new and bespoke and innovative use case, someone else is already doing, respectfully. So have a look, see whether the messages that are in another dialect might fit your use case. And then rather than redefine a message, propose that message gets moved across into common.xml so that everyone has access to it. You'll see over the last couple of years, there's been quite a few instances of messages being lifted up out of ArduPilot Mega into common, rather than duplicating or replicating an equivalent message into common, and hence reducing that opportunity for interoperability, which is really what having that centrally managed standard is all about. The other thing, and this is something that rule scripting has made much, much more accessible for people, is that if your use case for a new message is relatively simple, like you're just sending down a key value pair, name value float through Lua is an incredibly simple and powerful way to get data from the autopilot to a consumer of it, be that the ground station or a companion computer. There's examples in the scripts directory. I think mag heading is probably a simple one where it's just sending down the heading of the vehicle over a name value float. That's all there. It's really easy to use, and it's much less painful than defining new messages for those simple use cases where it's just a key value pair you're trying to send out.
Yes, I'd just add to that. If you're developing your message for ArduPilot because you think it's too slow to go through the MAVlink process, you could well be right. But it is good as a politeness to make us aware of it. We would quite like to, if you look at, say, the RPM message that moved across recently, that was definitely improved by going through the process into common. It's not exactly the same message as it was. It does, it does more things, more eyes on stuff, more use cases addressed. Sometimes we do slow things down for no purpose. I'm not saying you must go through us I think you'll get benefit long term. And then there, as James said, there is a good chance it will end up in multiple GCSs supported by multiple platforms.
Please.
Question of ignorance. Why can't we just send everything via a link? I appreciate there an interoperability that you're trying to achieve there, but is there another technical reason why for a closed system, for example, that we're not looking for a service, we'll just spam out a load of data?
So I guess, so no value float, as I said, it just sends out that kind of key value pair. So if you're trying to send something that's a bit more sophisticated than just a single data point, then obviously it's not the best tool to use. Sending a command as a series of named value floats, I guess, is possible, but the handling on that, kind of gets a bit more complicated than using the command interface, and where you have those seven parameters is kind of really defined in there.
Well, you would have to rewrite your command interface to respond with a named thingy as an act. There's efficiency of the package.
Yeah. So yeah, bandwidth efficiency and coherence.
Yes.
If you wanted to send latitude, longitude as two named value floats, well, first of all, a float can't represent a latitude better than 1 meter, 1.5 meters, depending on where you are on the Earth's surface. But your latitude and longitude are going to be arriving at different times, and they won't necessarily be consistent with each other. And so if you need to send like a quaternion, it starts to get very, very messy. But just the bandwidth would make it, the bandwidth consumption would be gone enormously. It would no longer be possible to use standard, I guess, RFA radios.
Yeah, you've got a huge packet overhead there. And that's why sometimes you see these, the high latency messages have absolutely all the telemetry in them. They send one message very, very rarely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, high latency is kind of.
Yeah.
This kind of answers some of that question, I guess, a little bit. So no value float's kind of how IDPilot sends that arbitrary data down if we choose to. And Mission Planner actually has a good way to display that within the HUD. So bottom left where you have where you can monitor all that telemetry coming in, you can actually assign one of those to a specific name value float as it's coming through. You're sending down a specific new set of data. There are some other ways in MAVlink to do similar things. So there is a named value int, which is an int32 sign. We don't use that in IDPilot at the moment, but if we needed the additional precision, for some reason we could. Basically, the structure of that message is exactly the same as named value float, it's just an int. PX4 uses a series of messages for debug, which again are structurally similar in their intent. They tend to send vectors, I think, rather than
and it's supported.
And also within IDPilot, within IDPilot Mega, we have the data 16, 32, 64, 96 messages, which are basically just sending down chunks of data. They're not packed within IDPilot itself, but they are within our XML. So you can use them within MAVlink or anything like that. So I mean, Tridges use those to good effect to send video down over RFD 900 and that kind of thing. So if you want to do something that is just packing arbitrary bytes into the MAVlink stream, then they're there. Any questions on any of that?
I guess for big files, you could use MAVFTP.
Yeah, exactly. And that's probably a better option than Data 96 for where it's suitable, and that it's a bit more coherent. But the implementation of MAVFTP at the other end is obviously a bit more complex. Next. Right, that's you.
Okay. So this is a bit about pain points, really, and a lot of them are a bit about people and process. And well, I guess I'll go through them in order. Common isn't common. So I alluded to this before. Just because a message exists doesn't mean that it is implemented on a particular flight stack. Just because a command is implemented on a particular flight stack doesn't mean that all the parameters are implemented or exactly implemented as you might expect. It's quite common for one or two of them to fall off the edge. MAVlink is supposed to tell you that maybe you've misused some of the extra ones, but for efficiency reasons, it doesn't always tell you about the parameters that aren't used. There are partial implementations, particularly in the early stages. I heard Randy's done the gimbal protocol. There's quite a lot to that, but there are missing bits right now. So how do you know as a user, and how do you know in what version? Similarly, yes, I've covered that. What version is supported? There are very slight difference between what ArchPilot does and PX4 does for both command protocol and for missions. And then there might be new features we want to add. And so how do you spot those things? And lots of stuff that isn't used very widely by anybody, possibly nobody. There was a lot of early on stuff that was a bit experimental. I think early on, the whole process was, we have a good idea for something, let's shove it in common. Now I'm talking very early on, way before my time. Now it's very much when we have people come along, we want at least one person or one flight stack to say, I'm going to be stakeholder, I'm going to create an implementation. And that's a necessity just to get rid of some of the crap, rubbish that we've got sitting there and it's been sitting there for years. And we've tried to sort out various aspects of these, but we've had a lot of trouble finding palatable solutions to everybody. Okay. So I just want to look at one of these things to address now, and that is getting rid of some of the rubbish. And you may say, well, why do we need to get rid of some of the rubbish? Basically, because there's an awful lot in there that people don't discover, or do discover. They don't know it's, they think it's useful. It takes quite a lot of effort to find out that it doesn't exist, it's not supported, and so forth. So there's one of the very first steps. I thought, if we get rid of all the rubbish, if we have a pattern if we have a better way of doing something, we all use it. Every user, and then we remove the old message that isn't supported anymore, possibly after a very long time, but at least it's gone eventually. So this is around mostly processes. At the moment, we have a WIP tag that indicates something is work in progress. We have a deprecated tag, which means superseded. Doesn't mean deprecated. It's not going anywhere. It just means that somebody else has invented a new way of doing things. And there's nothing here to tell you that you shouldn't be using the old one other than that flag. So what we want to move to is a life cycle where we have WIP, then it's stable, it lives there for a long time. Eventually it gets superseded. And as it becomes useful to people, we work to some kind of plan that, maybe in 2 years, we've got it in the flight stack. If we've managed to introduce this new thing and we've got agreement from flight stacks that's a good idea, then I think, 2 years, 2 or 3 releases is reasonable. We agreed it was a good thing. Let's actually implement it. If it wasn't good enough, we shouldn't have, for us to implement it, shouldn't have gone into common. Then superseded we'll keep, yeah, and then but deprecated really mean deprecated, and that means that we have an intent to remove. Again, doesn't have to be next year, doesn't have to be next release, and lastly, it's gone. Now, the only way I can see this working is that we actually have releases, okay, and we give people plenty of notice what's going to happen, and those releases happen quite regularly, and they might say it's 2 years, 4 years before this is going out, but there is a plan to remove this. What I would also like to do, that there seems to be some problems with this, is have build time warnings, or if you try and build it and it's got a WIP flag and you're in a release build, it gives you a warning, some kind of build warning to stop you from including that in release. Now, there are issues with that because as Tridge said, you don't know, you don't want those messages going to just anybody because they can't do anything about it. But we do need a way of making sure that people aren't using things they shouldn't be. We don't want people taking up a deprecated message just as we're about to remove it. So we also need...
Probably worth just articulating a little bit further why we are so concerned about the work in progress messages. And the key reason there is that whip tag basically means that message isn't stable. The definition isn't stable. Changes can happen basically without notification to the broader community as it gets implemented, as it gets tested and adjusted, to try to figure out, you know, how to best achieve what the intent behind that message is. As soon as...
So my question is, why have that, you know, in a master plan in the first place, you don't want people to use it?
Yeah. Right. So, and that's why we created development.xml, is to try to provide that buffer for those work in progress messages.
But that's still in the master.
Right. So the challenge is, how do you get broad testing of something without exposing it? Right. So with MAVlink, it's that's a global ecosystem of unmanned system or uncrewed systems and all the peripherals that go with that, all trying to do similar things, and we want to get them working towards a standard. So when someone comes up with a need for a new message or an adjustment to an existing message, we need a way to make that visible, but we also need a way for people that aren't involved in the development of it to understand that it's not stable. It's not something they should use just yet unless they're willing to be part of that development cycle, right? So that's why we have that whip tag. In order to reduce the risk of those whip messages finding themselves into stable autopilot releases, we've pulled them all out of common as far as we can, and there's some exceptions that exist to this, unfortunately, into development.xml, so that they are, to some extent, cocooned from the development release, from the stable releases. The challenge with that is that only works for a brand new message. If we want to change the enum to an existing message, for instance, you can't do that in development.xml. You're changing the implementation or the utility of a message to a degree, but it's already a stable message. You're just adding an additional state or use case to it. You can't do that in development.xml. It just doesn't work. Similarly, commands are like that as well. There's a few cases, and there's a few other cases, plus stuff that was already work in progress before we created development.xml that has already made its way out into stable autopilot releases, which creates a problem that is why Hamish is talking about with today, in that once someone releases a stable autopilot firmware that uses work in progress MAVlink messages, very hard for us to then change that message without breaking that flight stack. And that is not going to be accepted very well. It does create some tension for me and Hamish between the different autopilot stacks as to who gets to decide when a message is stable. And we'd really like that to at least for common.xml, to sit within the MAVlink organization. So, because we're the people that have access to all of those other use cases beyond just that one flight stack that wants to use it right now. So there is some tension there. Exactly the best way to manage that is basically just through discussion, negotiation, and making sure that everyone knows what each other's doing. So that if someone does want to firm up that message and remove the whip tag, we can socialize that across the community and make sure that that no one has any major objections to it, or if there is a quick adjustment that can be made, that can be cycled through as best as we can. Back to you, Stephen.
Yeah, no, we just don't want we don't want you to have any nasty surprises. And so as a first step, we'd like to put in some proper process. Now, there was a statement made earlier, which was, I'm not paid for that. And that is a very damn good point. I'm not paid to just do anything either. And so that's why we need lots of lead time. And we need to have people at some sort of architectural level understanding or committing. If we're going to agree these are stable, then somebody needs to ultimately be willing to get rid of the ones that are rubbish and accept the ones that they think are important. So I'm hoping this will do this, or that we can find better ways of managing this particular problem. And we're very open to suggestions, but we've sort of tried a few alternatives over the time, and that we're just not sure how we can move forward without something like this. Yes,
I think it's really important for us as a community to understand that there is core features that were always that are there that settle down. The only way to support development is to also those people that are pushing forwards into these new areas and using these new messages, is they understand that the pleasure of using this new message or this new functionality is they also have to take the responsibility that this is new, and they are going to have to update their systems to take into account changes or revisions and things like that. Users can't have their cake and eat it too. If they want new shit, they've got to accept that this is a development process and development of understanding. We don't know what we don't know yet, and like I base this with with all the guided mode stuff. I base this with as we understand the problem better, we are going to evolve that, make better. We can change all of the auto navigation to improve that dramatically. Everybody's missions are going to change, but if you want the improved functionality, you've got to take the cost of being flexible, and there's always the ability to stay with the old code. It's your decision to upgrade as the user, and if you want to upgrade, then it's up to you to stay up to date as well. Especially like with that new functionality labeled as new. I think that's an appreciation. People don't appreciate, you know, that there is a responsibility on them as well as us.
there is. I think it's a lot of these things are back to what is a user. Okay, so there's a whole class of users who don't care about which autopilot they're using. They are actually incapable of going into the flight stack and using this stuff. So it's more about, do we want them to be able to address certain use cases with their companion computer using us rather than an alternative? Do we want that to be easy for them, or do we want them to pick somebody else because somebody else has addressed those needs better? So even though some of this stuff is not your problem or my problem or anybody's problem, and yes, we do need stakeholders because we're sick of putting things in that just sit there forever and no one implements. That's a bigger waste of time than anything else we can do. It's not all about us. And that's fundamentally, it's not all about us. So we are trying to do a typical release cycle where we can start to highlight new things. We can start to remove old things. We can actually, one of the big things we'd like to do is have stuff in standard.xml, which is actually genuinely standard, stuff that people can rely on. So that's the last point. We need a lot more testing in place to be able to do that kind of thing, so that stuff is really standard. In fact, it's a bit of a can of worms, because what does standard mean? Just because it works for plane doesn't mean it works for hydrocopter. You know, I have no solutions for those problems yet.
With that standard.xml, I guess the first step we've made there is breaking out what's now minimal.
Yeah.
Which is an include into common at the moment,
Mhm.
or include into standard, which is an include into common. And that's kind of, you know, what is the minimum MAVlink implementation to exist on a MAVlink network. The next step is growing that into that standard.xml. There's some rub points, I guess, across the ecosystem as to what should be in standard, or what is the difference conceptually between standard and common. Hamish and I are trying to work through those. But I think that we will get there, so that we can get this standard.xml as being an agreed baseline implementation for an autonomous vehicle. And that will get rid of some of the confusion that exists with common.xml. As Hamish said before, just because a message exists doesn't mean it's supported. And have this standard.xml that just has supported messages in it.
Yeah.
There'll still be work to be done by implementers of MAVlink as to whether it's implemented how they think it should be. And in the case of ID Pilot, where we have 6 or 7 different vehicle type targets, how it's implemented, or if it's implemented across those different vehicle types. But at least it'll get a long way to lowering the barrier of entry for using MAVlink.
That's good.
Yeah.
What framework is there currently in terms of that can helps inform these decisions? So maybe, for example, like these messages should be agnostic to solution, otherwise we're never going to be followed. And like, what about avoiding duplication in data sets of key messages? Like, what is there a framework currently that we have for making those decisions?
So the question is, does MAVlink have a framework for making decisions towards standardization? Yeah. Right. So there's kind of two. One is those fortnightly development calls. More broadly, there is an RFC, and we'll get to that, I think, on the next slide or the slide after. There's there's an RFC that's linked there. But there is a request for comment, an RFC repo that sits within MAVlink. So broader proposals that are perhaps beyond just a single message or affect something that's beyond just those definitions and actually at the kind of more protocol definition kind of level is handled through that RFC process. So things like the component
metadata, yeah.
Was there
the standard flight modes was the last
standard
one.
flight modes, Gimbal V2 went through that. And so there's I don't have a link to the actual RFC kind of list in this, but we are about to talk about one specific RFC just to try to generate some discussion on it and move it forward.
Yeah, I would point out there is only two things. Firstly, there's no way to tell at the moment because we don't have a great process other than for submission and discussion around these things. We don't have a great process for ending them. So if you go and see any of these RFCs, you won't know what actually ended up being done by the various communities. That's not good. That's how it is. And I think also to answer your original question, there's quite a lot of we're quite conservative about change, and there's a lot of common sense in it. So there's lots of questions, and I think we probably made mistakes, but I don't think anybody's been thoroughly broken by anything that's gone through in recent times. No?
Just say a positive comment about the gimbal messages. I'm not sure if that went to the RFC. I didn't, but
should have.
Yeah, it seemed to go through a lot of discussion between Ollie and Julian. Although at first I didn't like the message that much, I've grown to appreciate them actually. So there is like one missing piece. I've already discussed a few days ago, but overall it's quite useful. And I'm glad I didn't have to do that myself.
Good. Yes, please feed that back sort of by an email or something, because I'm going to forget exactly what I have to do. Yeah, I like that. The statement was a support of the gimbal messages. That was quite difficult. It was an interminable process, but it solved one of the pattern problems of MAVlink is that how you instance things if you're not using component IDs to do it. And that's a pattern which comes up a lot when you're working with components. And the original solution was to allocate IDs. And at some point it changed so that we were supposed to use map type. So this is a good generic kind of approach that can be used in future to sort these kinds of problems out.
Right. RFCs.
I can introduce this one. This is a Tridge RFC. And it solves very, very cleverly a couple of problems with MAVlink or problem points in a mostly compatible way. As it says up there, it allows more than the 255 vehicles. Can't use 0 for a system ID because that's the broadcast. There's another problem that you can't, if you've got a router sitting in the middle of a system at the moment, it can't forward a message it doesn't know about. So if you've got a routing component, it has to be updated as you update your messages. Otherwise, it will just strip the message out of the stream. So this means that lots of useful things like you wouldn't have to hold all of the CRC extras which identify what a message is in your autopilot. Right?
You can actually route at the moment, but you can't route with any integrity checking.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Okay.
you might route some random data that isn't actually valid.
Yeah.
So this enhancement makes routing of unknown messages more robust.
Yes. Yes, it makes it more robust, and it also does mean that you don't have to keep things updated, which is
Particularly for mesh networks.
yeah. No, I mean, I'm sure I've said how impressed I am. I would have said that this was, you know, I looked at this problem and I'm not very clever, but I did think this would be very hard to do compatibly, and it's pretty clever. What is the point of this statement? This is cool. I think it's the main thing. This is super cool. There's a lot of interest. It's a TRIDGE PR, or a TRIDGE RFC. So what does that mean? It means sometime in the next 6 months to a year, the full implementation will appear somewhere.
You're optimistic.
I have a question. No,
So
I did have one last point to make here. There is one comment from Ollie W, which is somewhat, you know, difficultly worded.
It's an Ollie W.
It's an Ollie W.
I like it. He's normally pretty insightful.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you saw it, but could you have a look? Because the RFC is supposed to be interactive, so we need to be closing the loop. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that this addresses one of the key limitations, as Hamish said, which is the 255 system IDs. That's becoming, I guess, the common use case that people think about as to why that limit is challenging is things like the drone light show. So we're already seeing IGPOL used with, you know, thousands of vehicles trying to coexist, and people get around it by just having, I guess, multiple networks all up concurrently. The other use case that's growing quite quickly is fleet management, where users or fleet owners want to not have to, I guess, reassign the IDs for their individual drones, so they can just have a drone come and go from that network as they like, without worrying about conflicts. So it is quite important that we solve this problem relatively quickly. There are easier ways to solve it, I guess, at a protocol level, but not in a backwards compatible way. And that is one of the, I guess, the drivers behind this particular design is maximizing that backwards compatibility. So yeah, I'd just encourage anyone who's involved in implementing a MAVlink, particularly on large fleets, have a look at that, provide input to that, because I think the sooner we can start progressing what is loosely MAVlink 2.1, then we can start to address some of those pain points and kind of free it up to move it forward and getting that into the ecosystem. Basically, it's using IP addressing rather than just the 16-bit.
Yeah, the originally way I wrote the RFC was going to 16-bit component IDs, system IDs. But we could go to 32-bit, allowing IPv4 and extra 2 bytes. But the extra 2 bytes will only be sent if your ID is more than 255.
Yeah.
And that's the trick in this, in that you only pay the cost when you need it.
Yeah.
And it may be worth going to 32-bit for the future where we're all on IP networks.
Yeah.
And that makes the addressing easy.
Yeah.
So what I like about this particularly is there are other ways of doing it, but it's compatible and you have that choice and it's easy. So you don't have to think, I already know MAVlink, now I don't know MAVlink. That's a damn good thing for most of us. Maybe not everybody, there'll be other approaches, but for most of us, it'll be a good thing.
I think that's all we've got. So we've got plenty of time for questions, comments, and criticisms.
Except for the last one, we're not taking those.
So open to the floor. Or YouTube, if anyone's asking questions there. Go, Brandon.
It's really simple, but all the gimbal messages are still work in progress, but everybody's using them as far as I know. They're built into gimbals that are at the door and being sold. And it's a process. I've actually got an item on my to-do list to
to get them removed? Is that the right process? I should just go.
That is the right process.
Yeah.
There, I've got an item on my internal to-do list is to put a date against all of our flagging so that there's a date, something has to be dealt with and run in CI, so I get reminded to test it again.
Yeah.
It's
actually a good example as to, so their whip, and as you've been implementing, you've identified that there's gaps in the Gimbal V2 protocol. But even though it's still tagged as whip, we can't change it because it's so widely deployed.
Yeah.
Which kind of gets back to our earlier point about how we manage, I guess, releases of MAVlink and.
Yeah, I think in this case, the gap can be closed with a new message. And currently, we're using the old messages for that gap.
Yeah.
So it's not terrible.
So another dimension to the slide you had about sort of management of evolving of messages and moving them from, for example, RGPilot XML to common.xml. Another dimension to that is the fact that a particular message can evolve within itself, both in the terms that you mentioned enums, but also because of the MAVlink 2 extensions.
yes.
And I know that in the past, one of the reasons I've sometimes resisted moving a message out of the RGPilot XML into common is a matter of the process of who manages future edition of extensions. Because once the message is moved into common, there's some perception that then means that any project can then propose an extension to that.
Absolutely.
And there isn't a cost to those extensions. And you can get collisions of extensions because the CRC extra doesn't cover extensions.
So that's a valid point. I know everybody will have heard that over the recording. Yes, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. That can happen. It will happen.
Yeah.
We always design for the zero, as you know, the zero value gets truncated, so it is always a choice.
Yeah.
If we couldn't do that, I guess we would use the other option, which is a bit build where you have to set 1 to show it's enabled. So we don't ever make an addition without the possibility or the default being no change.
Yeah, it would be interesting to be able to say that if something moves from RGPilot XML to common.xml to mark it as any extensions must be approved by RGPilot. And is that something that's...
I don't think it can be because because at the point it's moving to common, RGPilot's no longer the only user of it.
And that's the challenge. That's why the resistance to moving to common.
Yeah, and so that really comes down to, I guess, an acceptance of trying to support multiple stakeholders.
Yeah.
So does that answer your question? No, that problem absolutely exists.
That's how things work, which is valuable. But I thought I'd point out that was one of the reasons, because otherwise you might say, well, why don't we put it all in common? And that is, it's the management of the future evolution of messages. To me, the division of the XMLs is about the custodianship of the evolution of the messages.
So there's two parts to that, I guess. One is, you're absolutely right, and I think we kind of described that on one of those earlier slides with, I guess, the evolution and control of RGPilot Mega very much staying within the RGPilot organization, and common.xml sitting up with the MAVlink organization. So, and definitely, there's no intent and just wouldn't be palatable or workable to try to do that any other way. But so for things that RGPilot absolutely must maintain control of, then they really need to stay within RGPilot Mega.xml. What that doesn't do, though, is help interoperability and standardization.
Yeah, if we can find that middle ground somehow, where we welcome all users, but somehow maintain some degree of custodianship of the evolution of the message.
Well, we do that for engagement. Well, that's me standing here and representing.
That's right. And your participation has been really invaluable in that process.
So it's being engaged in that management of upstream MAVlink, I guess, is the best we can do there. In that, so between Julian, I guess, doing the bulk of the PX4 type mediation, I'm sitting representing kind of RGPilot, and Hamish being the judge.
But it's not
kind of works pretty well. It's not perfect,
yeah.
Particularly because I'm not doing the core implementation of this stuff into RGPilot. So there is a bit of a gap, and it kind of depends how much traction I can get with whoever it's going to affect the most within RGPilot, and trying to get that sorted out as early as we can. But I think that the communication is reasonably good there as far as keeping people synchronized and aligned.
And we are very, very conservative.
Yeah.
You know, we don't make any changes.
Just doesn't explain what the concern is for the conservative of the message, because I mean, we wouldn't break the previous definition that we had by adding extension. If somebody else
The problem is that there's no protection against one person adding a float, another one adding an in32. There's nothing, there's no structural CRC on that to protect and know that it'll misinterpret that in32 as a float. Plus, there is an overhead in one of the key things that tends to happen is sometimes extensions are added without thought to packing efficiency, because we are heavily reliant in MAVlink 2 on the trailing zero truncation property. And we've occasionally had extensions added after an array that causes a message to go from taking 15 bytes to taking 72 bytes on the wire, even though we're only adding 1 byte of information. And it's because of the way the packing, we utilize a particular trick in the packing mechanisms of MAVlink 2 that has some subtleties that not everyone who's extending a message understands.
I will confidently say that I have not merged, and I'm probably the only one who's merged into MAVlink in the last 2 years. No, well, occasionally, but yeah, we haven't done that.
Yeah, it hasn't been a significant issue. It's just one of those things in the back of my mind.
Yeah, we've caught that a few times, as
Yeah.
far as not badly packed extensions.
Yeah,
It is something we absolutely look for. What could pop up is I guess competing extensions.
yeah,
The biggest risk there though is not so much modified extensions or proposal to change extensions coming up into as PRs into MAVlink, but vendors that put on custom extensions. And then you end up, because you don't get the CRC check on the extensions, you end up with conflicting messages.
I mean, the proper solution for us to do it longer term is to have explicit array length encoding to allow multiple packed arrays. So you have, at the moment, the only way you can do an array efficiently is have it at the end of the message.
Yeah.
But you've got 4 arrays, they can't all be lost.
Yeah.
So we could use one of the compatibility bits in the protocol header to say all arrays are encoded with a link byte, right? And if we did that, then indeed we could do that. That would mean that when we added array extensions, right, we would no longer have this packing issue, which would give us a lot more freedom in the evolution of messages.
So I would prefer even, but that's awesome because that works available everywhere, wherever you happen to have an array.
Yeah, it could even repack existing messages. It would, however, make the generated code more complex because it would no longer be a direct mapping to a C structure. So it can't be a straight mem copy. There has to be an explicit linearization step for each of the elements in the structure.
Yes, so I can see it's a bit harder, which is why it would be really nice if we could take some of those extensions and things that we've got already and actually have a new message and we accept that we're going to update, we're going to,
Yeah,
I don't know, because I know that's got flash costs and so forth. That's another nice way to clean things up and get your protection back on the message integrity because it's in the CRC.
yeah, yeah. The other one I thought I'd mention that we don't have at the moment, but we sort of work around sometimes. You mentioned a bit with the data 96 type messages. I think we should have a standardized or semi-standardized methodology for people to send structured arbitrary data, which can be larger than 256 bytes, from ground stations to applications. For example, from a ground station into a Lewis script via MAVlink.
Yeah.
But in a form where a viewer of the MAVlink can display the contents. For example, it could be JSON or Google protobufs or something like that. Some way of tunneling state data which can be unpacked and parsed. Because I think there's more and more applications I'm seeing where people are getting complex interactions of applications running with some code in the aircraft, some code in the ground station. And they want to be able to represent some state information related to trees that have been planted or tags that have been seen or that type of thing, which just doesn't fit.
So I would call that component metadata, but kind of, but it's arbitrary data in a JSON format that you move around using.
Yeah, and maybe we go for JSON, maybe some binary JSON format, maybe, I mean, there's all sorts of different formats out there, but getting one well supported by the tooling would be a huge step forward.
Yeah, so there, as Hamish said, there already is that component metadata or component microservice that's sitting there, but it's I'd argue that it's probably not.
It might not be a perfect fit,
Yes.
but the concepts are similar.
Yeah.
Anyway. Let's take that one offline. It is a good discussion. If we keep on getting people who want that solved, then we need a stakeholder. And we can help provide some of the gatekeeping to make sure that changes are agreed or eliminate, or we agree that we don't need that managed.
There is an alternative that try to have around, which is to allow MAVlink messages to be defined by messages on the wire. So instead of sending over a chunk of JSON, you send over the definitions for the message at the request by the student.
Yeah, so I have a few concerns. Again, let's take that offline. I mean, that was this point, and
Hamish and I argue about this.
I think it's cool. But I reckon again, we have a system and we can be compatible by sending the definitions across as component metadata without having to change anything else.
It's also not very MAVlink-y. It's not. The problem with start doing self-describing messages is it makes implementation of a new message or a new application, I guess, almost trivially easy. What it doesn't do is allow interoperability. So it really depends, what the intent is behind that message that you're describing, or that new message. Whether it is something that just exists in this really closed kind of implementation, or something that you actually want other people to be able to play in as well.
As you had your hand up?
Yes, I was just going to say with regard to all of the historical messages, quality, it seems to me like a nice big order of every platform you've got access to.
Yes.
Throwing them all away and saying we're discarding all of having free, but every inside put that.
Yeah, so we kind of tried
Throw them all away.
that audit of implementation is hard. I mean, no one assumes that it's easy, but it's actually harder than you might think. It is, but I mean, using ArguPilot as an example, you might think it's easy and we can just, go into GCS MAVlink and look at the MAVlink headers file we've got in there and say that's ArguPilot's MAVlink implementation, but it's not. Like it actually isn't that trivial to find out even within ArguPilot all the messages we support.
And if you go back 2 versions and somebody's still running whole version of FlightStack X, and so that's back to a release process. I don't think we can do it once. I think we're going to have to do it iteratively and reliably and be able to undo things if we screw up. Yeah, I was hoping for 6 months, but actually realistically, we'll negotiate, probably end up 10 years.
And the challenge there is, that versioning in MAVlink may end up being a version of common.mavlink, and it's because it's really up to ArguPilot to manage ArguPilot Mega. So there's that kind of challenge there.
Yeah, and we do want to sync with MAVlink if we can. We don't want to make it really confusing for people how the different versions all affect each other, because that is more frustrating.
Do you ever consider separating the message definition from serialization?
The question is, have we considered separating the message definitions from the serialization or the protocol itself? Well, that already exists. That's kind of what Hamish was talking about there with MAVlink versus PyMAVlink, and that serialization is basically defined in PyMAVlink, which is managed and released separately. So, pip install PyMAVlink will get you the latest PyMAVlink release. And PyMAVlink, in addition to the Python library and Python helpers, is that serialization is those, it is the header generation, et cetera, is all sitting there because MAVlink kind of describes more than one thing, unfortunately.
In some senses, though, I think it will be up to MAVlink to sort out following us, because I don't think that the tail should pull the dog. So
The tail and the dog don't necessarily agree which is which. But.
well, MAVlink is just one output, and it's just one generator, MAVgen. So,
But it is the canonical generator.
it is a generator.
It's the canonical generator.
MAVgen is the canonical, but I would have said MAVgen C or C++ was that.
It comes out of MAVlink.
Anyway, whatever. The point is, well, the point is that they can far more easily take a time slice of us than we can guess what they're going to do. So it makes sense, yes, sir.
The JavaScript is itself against the single component. So that's very sort of
Okay.
Yeah.
Guaranteed.
Right.
I have a question on the testing of it, sort of, you mentioned earlier that Pilot shares what's currently implemented in certain platforms. Is that someone who's manually going through and saying, I support these things, or is this integrated in some test suite?
So there is a test suite. Well, there's multiple test suites.
Sorry, for what's supported, that is somebody going through it, or at least
What
it
is
was.
supported, that is manually code inspection, basically. Yeah.
You consider developing an independent set of tests that test MAVlink regardless of the platform that's implementing it?
Yes, that was what I was going to do on the fly here, and my starting point is invisible on the internet on GitHub at the moment. So it is more complicated than it looks. I think it has to happen. It won't tell us everything because whatever we do, it won't tell us everything, because testing messages or commands is relatively easy, but testing in depth some of the other protocols is a lot more complicated. But it will be a lot better to be able to run a test suite and say this version of RGPilot back X amount supports this particular message with this set of parameters, ditto with PX4, and that's what I wanted to do to start off the standardization process more than the deletion process. But I mean, it is the same problem. And yes, that will happen. It's just a matter of time that way. And if somebody who feels that they have expertise, Peter Barker, and would like to write that test suite, I will be writing it in Mav SDK. But the good alternative would be MAVlink, because it already there's a huge amount of test suites written in that. Yes,
I already got all about that. Yeah, the messages in pilot it doesn't actually actually implementation, it just finds the ones that it says that it was. But that might be something. It hasn't been noted yet. Discussions over whether recent pilot versions are reasonable for use in our pilot rules.
is it a query tool? So firstly, the question was, or a statement that I already have a PR that checks for what's supported to some extent that hasn't been merged. And my response or question is it just sending messages or commands and seeing if it gets a response, or is it a threat? Or
it doesn't check what has been it's part of the other pilot code base and finds that that's like where the find messages go like that is now messages defined in other pilot.
okay. Just for my interest, does it also break down by vehicle and
Yeah.
that's cool. Yes, that would be useful. It doesn't have to live in RGPilot to be of interest to me. So if I'll chase it.
Yeah.
We have some dynamic generated case. Yeah.
What repo is that PR against?
It's again the other pilot there. Just going into the build.
Yeah.
The only thing holding that back is
Yeah, I think our thinking on that has evolved relatively recently as well.
Yeah, we got
Right.
I haven't figured out what that.
I'm out of time.
3.6. So I'll be floating around if anyone has questions.
Yeah, I'm here all day. So we're out of time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
I was going to say done with MAVlink, but another plug for the panel discussion at the end. So if you're on YouTube, you've got questions, put them in the YouTube chat. If you're in the room, there's a whiteboard over there. Just so we can start coordinating and structuring that panel discussion. Thanks.
So thanks for all your efforts on the MAVlink standardization. It's really is appreciated.